Hello everyone, welcome to the Soft Landing Programme where we are joined with Capital Law, who are going to be running an Employment Basics for the Employer session. I'm Sarah, obviously not the usual Chloe, so unfortunately you're stuck with me today. I'm going to hand over to Rebecca now, who's a Senior Associate in Employment and Immigration Law. We are going to run this session. There's a hard stop at 12. But Chloe has asked me to remind you that there is another 3 p.m. session with Capital Law on company structure and setting up a company in the UK. That's another online session as well. So looking forward to you all joining us there. Any questions, please just put them in the chat box and either me or Rebecca will reply to you. But yeah, I'll hand over to Rebecca now.
Thank you very much. So I'm Rebecca. I'm a Senior Associate in the Employment team at Capital. I was due to be joined by my colleague Evie today, but unfortunately, I was just explaining she's been caught up on an urgent matter. So you stuck with me, but hopefully it'll be a good session nevertheless. I do have a hard stop at 12. So if you do have questions and I don't have time to answer them at the end, please feel free to send them through to Sarah and we'll try and answer them that way. So in terms of the agenda, this is what we're hopefully going to cover today. I do have a lot to get through, so I will be just talking at you. But of course, if you want to interrupt me if I haven't been clear on something, please do. Either raise your hand. I think I should be able to see that still through the through Teams, or just shout out. That's absolutely fine. So yeah, we're going to go through the recruitment process. I'm going to talk to you about employment status and what that means in law. We'll discuss what needs to be in a contract of employment. I'll touch on discrimination and why you need to understand what that is as employers. We'll go through what happens if things go wrong, essentially, and you do need to dismiss an employee. We'll cover off some common pitfalls, and then we'll just sort of zoom through an employer checklist at the end. So starting off then with the recruitment process. The first step is always to identify the job vacancy, that what you actually need as a business and how best to advertise it. That's a really important point, by the way, because the best place to advertise a vacancy will depend on who exactly you're trying to attract. So it is always worth thinking about. So employers typically use various platforms such as like job boards, Indeed, LinkedIn, that kind of thing. Company websites, if you've got one of those, using recruitment agencies to kind of really push that that vacancy, or social media. We're seeing that more and more, particularly LinkedIn, but also things like Instagram. Just let David in. So yeah, do have a think about that. Preparing the job description and person specification is also really important. So it's got to be clear and accurate, highlighting both the skills that you need and what that individual will be responsible for when they are employed. Not only does that obviously help attract the right candidates, but it also ensures you're compliant with UK employment law around discrimination. Now, what I mean by that is it's very easy to fall foul of UK discrimination law in job advertisements. It's something we see quite a lot, because we use sort of adjectives and hyperbole sometimes when we're doing these job advertisements, in an attempt to attract the best candidates. So we might say something like, I'm looking for a dynamic and energetic individual, for example. But if that's for an office job, how dynamic and energetic do you really need someone to be? The problem with putting something like that in a job advertisement is that it might actually put someone who's, for example, disabled, physically disabled, off applying for that job, and that could lead you to fall foul of UK discrimination law. So when you are putting these specifications in your job advertisements, it is important that they're actually tangible things that you really actually need, as opposed to these adjectives and so on. The person specification, you need to obviously then sort of source your candidates from your applications. So many companies also use recruitment agencies to help screen applicants, but you can do it yourself. You don't need to use a recruitment agent. The only thing I would say about that is I would always recommend that 2 people do that screening, to hope ideally 2 very different people with different backgrounds, etc. Because if you've just got the one person who is, for example, particularly interested or looking at someone's grades or where they went to university, etc., that's all well and good, but you may also want someone looking at the likely cultural fit for that person. So more of the softer stuff. Always good to have 2 perspectives. The next bit then would be shortlisting and interviewing. So this is where the sort of real selection process begins. Shortlisted candidates are normally invited to interview, obviously. That can be in person or over the phone. Most commonly now it's via video. I'm sure you've all been to interviews before, and so you'll appreciate that the purpose of it would be to assess the candidate's technical skills, experience, and also, I can't stress this enough, that cultural fit. That is something, I'll come on to it in more detail later, but we see particularly new employers fall down on sometimes, is they focus on getting the best person in rather than perhaps the right fit for their vision for their business. And remembering as well, back to this discrimination thing, as an employer, you must, sorry, I've got another person joining in. As an employer, you must avoid discriminatory questions. So there's a piece of legislation in the UK, the Equality Act 2010, and that protects applicants, job applicants, from being discriminated against. My favourite example of when this happened in an interview that I'm sure my husband won't mind me sharing is when he interviewed for a job. He's dyslexic, he's also Welsh, and the interviewer said something flippant. I think he thought he was being funny, along the lines of, "Oh gosh, how does it feel to be dyslexic and Welsh?" Now, my husband took that as a joke, but actually that is something that could have got that employer in big trouble. So just be careful when you are doing those interviews, because job applicants are protected. The next step then would be to make an offer to that individual. In the UK, the offer, oh, sorry, Jason, can you not see the presentation? Can everyone else see the presentation?
Yeah, I can.
Okay. I'll come out and come back in.
Oh, amazing. Okay. I'll re-add you now, Jason.
So as I said, so after you've done the interview process, you would make a job offer. In the UK, this job offer will most of the time be a conditional job offer, and that would be subject to reference checks, DBS checks if that's relevant to your industry, and it could be, you know, you can essentially put whatever you want in terms of that in that conditional offer. You can make an unconditional employment offer. However, I would really highly recommend that you don't do that, that you always are really clear that any offer is subject to XYZ, just because it gives you that flexibility then if you do need to change your mind. And that could be for all sorts of reasons. You could actually, you know, get a couple of months down the line whilst that person's working their notice from their previous employment and realise that actually that person's not the right fit, or you need something slightly different. And we can talk about that in more detail in a bit. The job offer will need to outline the role, salary, working hours, benefits, and certain other key terms. And you'll need to turn your mind sooner rather than later to the actual employment contract, which we'll go through in a lot more detail in a moment. because certain information does need to be provided to that employee on day one, and actually ideally before day one, because you don't want to get in a situation where you give them an employment contract on day one and actually then there's an argument over the terms. So finally, then, just a bit about onboarding. Once the individual is actually in employment and the contract's signed, you should give some thought to onboarding. And by that, I mean introducing the employee to the company, providing training, setting up their workspace, making any adjustments that might need to be made for that workspace. Ultimately, it's all about making someone feel welcome, and the sooner they feel welcome, the sooner they'll give you their best on a day-to-day basis. So, right. I've just been talking about hiring someone as an employee, as you gathered, but that's not always it's not always the best option for a new business. Hiring someone as an employee, there are other ways you can engage with someone, engage someone's services without making them a formal employee of your company. So there are 3 main categories of employment status, or we call it employment status, but it covers these other categories as well, and they're set out on this slide. So you've got employees, workers, and contractors. The distinction in employment law between the 3 categories of employee, worker, and self-employed contractor is quite significant, and that's for a number of different reasons. So obligations, essentially. So employers and employees have obligations that are implied into the contract between them, and we call that the mutual duty of trust and confidence. There are certain protections which only apply to employees, most particularly the rights on termination. We'll talk about those later. Workers are also covered with some of those protections, but they're to a more limited extent. Self-employed contractors have hardly any protections under employment law. We have something in the UK called the ACAS Code of Practice on disciplinary and grievance procedures. That only applies to employees. The tax treatment of a person providing services depends on their status for tax purposes as determined by HMRC. However, the tests are very similar. Employees are paid through... Sorry, we've got another question about the presentation. Is everyone looking at a slide with employee, worker, and contractor written on it?
I'm looking at page 2. What are the main categories of employment status?
Yeah, with the black circles on it. Yeah. Okay. Fine. Yeah. I don't know if there's.
Yeah, mine's. I'm fighting Teams on both the laptop and the phone right now, so it might just be me. So okay.
I think everyone's fine.
It's still not displaying anything for me, so it says can't display presentation. So I don't know. Yeah.
Oh,
but
sorry,
we're listening to you attentively, Rebecca. That's the most important thing.
Thank you so much. Okay, well, any other questions about the presentation? I think Sarah said we'll try and send the presentation out so you can have a read of it afterwards. All good. So we're just talking about tax. Employees in the UK are paid through a system called Pay As You Earn, and they're taxed at source. Workers are also paid through that. Contractors are not paid through that, and they sort their own tax out. We'll talk a bit more about that in a moment, but as you can see, there are clear distinctions, and it's important to understand those when you are looking at status. Right, let me just, where are we going? Right, next slide. So
I'm sorry, could you do it? I apologize, I was distracted by the whole thing. So there's and this was one of the slides that I really want to, or one of the points that I really coming into this one to understand. So you said there are 3 status points. There's a regular employee. Yes. There's what in the States, I think you call it something different. In the States, we call it independent contractors. But there was a third one, a middle one. Can you describe the middle one?
And the middle one is exactly a middle one, and I will be explaining exactly what that is in a moment. But yes, you've identified it perfectly. Is that you've got the one end of the spectrum proper employees.
Right.
And you've got independent contractors the other end, and then there's this sort of hybrid thing that we have in the UK called a worker, who has some of the rights but not all of the rights, some of the protections, not all of them, and it is really quite difficult for employers to navigate. But I'll explain in more detail what exactly a worker is in a moment.
Perfect.
So
Thank you.
just no worries. So just quickly explaining what an employee is. I mean, I'm sure a lot of you will have your heads around that already, but typically we define them as a permanent member of staff. They don't always have to be permanent, but that's the kind of more traditional model. And they usually have an open-ended contract with the employer, as in there's no fixed end date. But again, you can have a fixed term employee, but I'm just in general terms, I'm an employee of Capital, and I don't have a fixed end date on my contract. I could stay there as long as I want, as long as I don't get sacked. So within this relationship, the employer has a significant level of control, as they tell the employee exactly what they need them to do on a daily basis, how to do it, and when to do it. So we call this, sort of in sort of loose terms, the kind of really typical master and servant relationship, and that's the best way to think about it. If you mess up as an employee, employers can take disciplinary action against you. And as we've spoken about before, in terms of the tax situation, income is taxed at source, and the employer is obliged to pay national insurance contributions and pension contributions, etc. So it is the sort of full ingratiated sort of relationship between the two parties. Employees are entitled to more employment rights than anyone because of this kind of real, like, locked in relationship that there is between the employer and the employee. So they have the right to be paid at least the national minimum wage, and that's set each year. They're protected by the working time regulations, which govern the number of hours that someone's permitted to work in 1 week, and also what rest breaks you have to give them. They can't be unfairly dismissed or unlawfully discriminated against. They are entitled to certain statutory payments, so sick pay, maternity, paternity and pay and leave, and also statutory redundancy pay if they're made redundant. Mention the working time regulations in the UK. Every employee is entitled to 5.6 weeks of paid annual leave each year. We're going to talk a bit more about holidays shortly. And they must receive proper notice about the end of their contract. So there's specific rules around how you give notice, how much notice to give, etc. Workers then, as I mentioned, they sort of fall in between the employee and the independent contractor. They have some of the duties and expectations of an employee, but also some of the duties and expectations of an independent contractor. They, generally speaking, have more flexibility regarding how and when work is completed, but they're still under the control and supervision of a manager, normally, and the employer has the same obligations from a tax perspective in terms of deducting tax at source. Because of the slightly more flexible relationship between the employer and the worker, workers aren't entitled to this full set of employment rights that employees get. So it's a bit of a quid pro quo. They get more flexibility, they get less rights. So some companies will try to sort of some companies will class someone as a worker rather than an employee because it's easier for the employer to do things like dismiss them. As I said, they have less rights. However, if you get that wrong and you sort of falsely class someone as a worker rather than an employee, that could obviously end up in that being challenged in legal proceedings. So if the following are true, then the person in question is most likely to be a worker rather than an employee. So one thing we would look at is the contract. If the individual has a contract that uses terms like casual, freelance, 0 hours, those sorts of things, that's indicative of a worker because they have that, as I said, flexibility. They would still be required to carry out that work as an individual. So whereas a contractor could potentially subcontract work. It's still that person that needs to do the work, and that's the main difference between a contractor and a worker, by the way, is that requirement for personal service. A worker will have normally the ability to choose whether or not they accept an assignment or to accept some work. So my classic go-to whenever I'm explaining what a worker is to think about like bar staff. So I don't know if any of you've worked in a bar before. I certainly have. There was a sign up sheet on the fridge in the back, which would say, you know, sign up to which shifts you want to do. If I didn't sign up for any of them, so what, doesn't matter. I just don't get any work. If I sign up for them, great, and I'll be paid if I come in and work them. When I am working though, I am outwardly facing a representative of that bar. I might wear a uniform. I might, you know, I have to abide by the rules of that bar. So that is a worker versus an employee who would, for example, be told, you need to be in, I need you to work Mondays, Tuesdays and Fridays between these hours. And if I don't turn up, then I'll be disciplined. Does that help to explain the distinction between employer and worker? Because it's not straightforward. If anyone's stuck on that, I can go over it again. Just conscious time. Fine, I'm going to take that as it was okay. So shout if there's any other questions. So then finally, just self-employed. As by process of elimination, you can kind of work out that self-employed contractor, again, my classic go-to when explaining this is, I need someone to build a wall in my garden. I don't care when they do it, how they do it, what they build it with. I just need a wall to be built. So I will call up a builder. The builder will pop along, build the wall when it suits him. You know, and that's the end of our transaction, and that's the end of the relationship. That's a self-employed contractor or an independent contractor. The terms are used interchangeably. That individual, I can just pay the builder whatever money he charges me to build the wall. He is then responsible for sorting out his own tax affairs. It's none of my business. Okay. Just to throw an extra spanner in the works, I suppose. We've had government change in the UK recently. So under the new Labour government, there are lots of proposals to change all sorts of things with regards to employment law. But one of them is to try and get, well, essentially almost get rid of this ambiguity between the three statuses and move to a more, well, actually move to what we have in tax law in the UK, which is you're either employed or you're not, which would make things possibly more straightforward, but then does mean that that group who are workers who want that flexibility may end up sort of, well, they will probably get more rights, but they may lose some flexibility. So it's all up for debate. Yeah, watch your space on that one. Okay, so contracts of employment then. If you have decided you want to hire someone as an employee, then you'll need an employment contract. Side note, the law changed in 2020, so you actually also need to provide a statement of particulars to someone, even if you've hired them as a worker, but I'll explain that in a moment. So I hate this slide, but this is all the stuff that needs to go in a contract. So this right to a written state, so sorry, I'm using the terms contract and statement interchangeably because most people will, the employment contract is also the statement. So the statement needs to be provided on day one, and all of this stuff needs to be in the statement. However, as you can see, there's so much stuff in it, it may as well be the employment contract. And so that is what most people do. They will hire someone, give them all of this information, plus anything else they want to include in one employment contract. So, I mean, well, I'll read it through anyway, but so name of employer and worker, date of employment or the date the employment or engagement begins, and that's important because that's relevant for the purposes of calculating service in that role. For employees only, the date continuous employment started, and that's again connected to the length of service in the role. So sometimes very briefly, sometimes you might be engaged or employed by a business, then you get given or you might go away, or you get a second contract, whatever it is, you'll need to put when the actual start of the continuous employment with that company is, even if the engagement has changed slightly going forward, so that you've got a new contract start date. Rate of pay, obviously, and the frequency of that needs to be all transparent. Hours of work, entitlement to holidays, any other benefits, including saying whether there are no other benefits, length of notice, job title, probationary period, information about whether someone needs to work outside of the UK for over a month. If they do, you have to put extra particulars about what will happen when that person is working outside of the UK for over a month, including what would happen to their pay, what currency they'd be paid in, how they'd be taxed. Any part of any training which the employer requires. So there's quite a lot of information that needs to go in that statement on day one, which is why I think I said a moment ago, it's really important that you get your sort of, if you are hiring an employee, you get your ducks in a row sooner rather than later before they walk through the door. The key thing to remember with what needs to go in this contract is it's all through the lens of transparency. The reason the law changed in 2020 was to increase that transparency between employer and employee. The government at the time decided that there was too much ambiguity in some employment contracts where someone would sign up to something and actually they wouldn't really have a full grasp of what that role entailed or what their benefits were, for example. So that's the rationale behind it all. In terms of stuff that can come separately, not on day one, you can include any information about sick leave and pay, paid leave, pensions, details of a collective agreement that will, I'm sure, be relevant to an awful lot of you. It's where you've got a union involved or you recognise a union. Any other training entitlements or disciplinary and grievance procedures, they can all sit somewhere else. They can be in a policy, or you can give them information in a separate document. But all of that still needs to be provided within 2 months. Quick caveat, obviously, if you don't manage to get all this stuff done on day one or within 2 months, there is a potential legal claim there, but that claim would be extinguished as soon as you did provide that information. So I'm not trying to frighten any of you, but it is important that you get this stuff done more from a managerial perspective than necessarily a strict legal perspective, although there is a legal reason for doing it. I mentioned holiday a moment ago, and I said that employees in the UK are entitled to 5.6 of paid annual leave each year. Very quick on this one because I could talk for an hour about holiday alone. In the UK, it is legal to do something called roll up holiday pay. The law on that has changed in the last year. So the only time you can do that is if someone is engaged as an irregular hours worker or a part-year worker, and where that is the case, where someone, you're not sure what their hours are going to be for that year, so that, as I said, irregular hours, you can, instead of giving them holiday, when you pay them, add a supplement of 12.07% onto their pay to cover off their holiday entitlement. 12.7% being 5.6 weeks of the annual year. I've got a whole set of notes on calculating holiday, but I think that that's going to be too detailed for the purposes of this this session. The point being that you can do it, which, as I said, has been a change in the last year. It can be really helpful for employers who, as I say, engage people on a more irregular basis to do this, but you do need to explain that you're doing it and how you're doing it from the outset to that individual. Okay, so a little bit about discrimination law in the UK. You've got to provide a safe environment for your employees, workers, contractors to work in. And by safe, I mean free of prejudice or discrimination. So in terms of who is protected, sorry, I think I've skipped. Oh, no, that's okay. In terms of who's protected under the Equality Act, which is our discrimination legislation in the UK, all employees are protected, all job applicants are protected, workers are protected, contractors are protected, and so are agency workers. The extent of the extent of the protection slightly differs, but it's best to assume, and as a good employer, a good business, it would be good to assume that everyone is protected and you don't want to discriminate against anyone, of course. In terms of what you're protected for in the UK, we have what's called the protected characteristics. There's 9 of them and they're all listed on here. So we've got age, and that's any age. That's not just like old or young, or age group. So I'm sure you'll all have been, you'll see a lot of stuff talking about like Gen Z or millennials or whatever. That would be age. Disability, it's a legal definition, disability, not a medical definition. Arguably, I suppose the legal definition could be actually more wide than the medical definition, in that it's where you've got a substantial adverse effect on someone's ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities. That doesn't need to be medically diagnosed, so it is really quite wide. Gender reassignment. So whether someone has undergone gender reassignment or is proposing to undergo changes. So again, something to just be mindful of. There's no medical requirement for someone to have legally changed their gender. Marriage and civil partnership is protected. So if you're married and you're discriminated against as a result of being married, then that's protected. I always find it quite funny. It doesn't apply the other way around. So as in you're not protected if you're single, it's only if you're married. It stems from, I guess, historical reasons with regards to, married women in the workplace and things like that. But yeah, just to be mindful of that. Pregnancy and maternity is protected. Race is protected. That includes colour, nationality, and ethnic origin. Religion or belief is protected, and that also includes not holding a belief or not having a religion. Sex, that is limited to man or woman. So for the purposes of non-binary people, that would probably sit more under gender reassignment than under sex discrimination if there was an issue there. And sexual orientation, so as in what you're attracted to, so attraction to any sex or gender. In terms of what I mean when I'm talking about discrimination, it's effectively doing any of these things, which I'll explain, in relation to one of those protected characteristics that I've just been through. So direct discrimination is where, because of protected characteristic, someone treats someone less favorably than they would treat others. So classic example, employer decides that they're not going to offer an employee a promotion because she's a woman, or doesn't pay an employee a bonus because they are black. So it's that because they are. It's actually quite, thank goodness, quite rare that we come across direct discrimination, because it's so blunt and so prejudicial. Fortunately, most people are better behaved than that, and they wouldn't discriminate on quite such an in quite such an obvious way. To show direct discrimination, you'll note I said less favourably. The individual has to have a comparator. So again, someone's not being offered a promotion because they are a woman. They would need to show, if I was a man, that's my comparator, I would have had that promotion. Indirect discrimination, that's where essentially you have something which looks like it applies equally to everyone, but actually discriminates against one particular group, often innocently in the first instance. But so, example, requiring an employee to work full time. That could disadvantage women as a group, since in general, women tend to take on more domestic childcare responsibilities than men, and so are more likely to want or need to work part-time. That's an example that's I think it's in the European guidance on the Equality Act. However, it's often less, it's often things like, I'm trying to think of an example that I've had recently. I mean, I come across it a lot in disability type claims where someone, there's a requirement to do certain things, whether that's, say something physical or work certain length of hours or something like that, and someone who is disabled is indirectly affected by that decision. Harassment then. Harassment has a colloquial meaning, doesn't it? But this is very specific under the Equality Act, harassment. So the definition of harassment under the Equality Act is where A harasses B if A engages in unwanted conduct related to a relevant protected characteristic, which has the purpose or effect of violating B's dignity or creating an intimidating, hostile, degrading, humiliating, or offensive environment for B. So it's very specific. It has to be connected to a protected characteristic. As I said, harassment has its own colloquial meaning. That forget that for the purposes of the Equality Act, it needs to be related to the protected characteristics. So interestingly, however, harassment, you don't have to be the person that is the subject of that unwanted conduct to be harassed. So again, classic example, people are all talking in the office, someone says something really racist. I'm not, it's not about my race. However, I'm still offended by what was said. I can still bring a harassment claim. So this is where people fall down on the whole banter situation. There's, the amount of harassment claims that I see, which come from there having been banter in the office or outside, whatever it is, which has offended someone, I get a lot of them. And then the next one on this slide is victimization. Again, has its own colloquial meaning, but I'm talking about specifically under the Equality Act. That is where you've already raised something under the Equality Act. I'll come to you in a second, David. You've already raised something under the Equality Act, and then you are treated badly because you've raised a complaint. So classic one, you raise a grievance that you've been discriminated against in some way, and then you're shunned. So that's that one. And then very quickly before I come to David, disability discrimination it has its own protections. So if you're disabled, you're protected with all of those things. So from direct discrimination, indirect harassment, and victimization, you also have a separate protection, which is against being discriminated against from something arising from your disability. This one is, I spend an awful lot of my time litigating over this, where someone, again, example, someone is on sick leave because they are disabled and they don't get a promotion. They didn't get the promotion because they are on sick leave. So it's not direct discrimination. It's not because they are disabled. It's because they're on sick leave. But that sick leave arise from their disability. So that's where the protection, and that's how that works. There is a there is a defense to to discrimination arising from a disability, which is that the employer had a proportionate means of. So the employer was taking proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. So again, in that example, employees on sick leave, they've been on sick leave for a year and they're not looking like they're going to come back. Dismissing them in that situation, for example, might be proportionate, even though that sick leave arose from a disability. Finally, then there's this thing called duty to make reasonable adjustments. If someone's disabled, that's a legal duty that as soon as you realise as an employer that someone has a disability in law, that you have to make adjustments for that person to overcome any disadvantages that they may face in the workplace. A reasonable adjustment could be adjusting physical aspects of the workplace. So classic example, wheelchair ramp. Providing auxiliary aids, so it's computer software sometimes, it's hearing loops, things like that, and then also potentially amending workplace policies or practices to ensure that that individual is not they're not disadvantaged by that those policies or practices. David, sorry about that.
No, thank you. I just wanted to go back to your banter comments, and you say you get a lot of comments on harassment. And I think with this group with the multiple cultures coming in and stuff like that, I think that you say you get a lot of them. Are a lot of them successful? And are you, and then, sorry, I missed the first couple of minutes. Are you typically defending the employee or the employer with those? And it's like, so can you just add a little more context? Obviously we need to be careful, not say stupid things and not let our people say stupid things, but it's can you provide a little bit more framework around that of what works, or what's kind of not necessarily right and wrong, but accepted and not accepted?
Yeah, so the key thing about the definition of harassment is that let me pull it back up. Let's break down the definition slightly then. So we've got the unwanted conduct. That's the first thing. It has to be unwanted conduct. So you've got a group of people who are all having banter with each other. They're all having a nice time. They do it all the time. I work with quite a lot of like manufacturing clients, and they're all having a great laugh on the floor, on the production floor, and lots of banter flying around. Everyone's engaging in it. Everyone's having fun. It's going to be difficult for someone who has engaged in that and was part of it all to then say, actually, that was unwanted. However, you have a brand new person that comes in, into that environment, and they see and hear all of this, and then they come to you and say, actually, that was awful. It was really, I really didn't, that was unwanted. That's when that happens. So normally when a new employee comes in. So it has to relate to a protected characteristic. So that's the other thing. So banter and chat and everything about what the latest football score was, and giving someone a bit of this because they support a certain team, whatever, that's not going to be harassment. Banter about the fact that someone's got an afro, or is from a certain place, or is a lesbian or whatever, that brings it under the Equality Act and under the definition of harassment, because it's related to protected characteristic. That conduct we were talking about has to have the purpose or effect. So it doesn't, I'm not saying that that group of people who are all having banter, that they were doing it on purpose to upset that person, because it can just be that it had the effect of upsetting that person, which is again how employers end up getting stuck, because their group of people, it's not like they're nasty people, but it may have had the effect of upsetting someone. And it has to do, as I said, this sorry, 1 second, let me just dismiss that. It has to have the effect, purpose or effect of violating someone's dignity, creating an intimidating, hostile, degrading, humiliating, or offensive environment for that person. That's quite wide, and that definition. I act for employers and employees. Generally speaking, where this comes up for employers, it's that banter thing. Where it comes up for employees, when it feels very different when I'm advising an employee on it, because that employee is ultimately the person who's been really upset by what's been said. Whereas the employer may take a sort of slightly different view of kind of like, oh gosh, like they're overreacting or something like that. I can give you an example of a case that's been quite extensively discussed in the UK in the last few years. I think the name of the case is Evans and Exactly. Essentially, banter going on in the office. Everyone's engaging in it. It's not great behavior, but it's tolerated as a whole by the office environment. Someone one day calls one of the employees a fat ginger pikey. Now, for those of you who don't know on this call, a pikey is possibly another word for sort of someone who is from the traveling community, so potentially would be connected to race. Ginger hair, potentially connected to someone's race or ethnic origin. Fat, not connected to any protected characteristics. It's okay to call people fat unless it's related to a disability. In that case, though, they did bring a harassment claim, and I believe it was on the basis of ethnic origin or racial or ethnic origin. They lost that case because I think there was evidence that at the time the guy was laughing along with it and actually saying, yeah, essentially agreeing that that's what he was, etc., and throwing something back which was equally as kind of unprofessional. So that's just a bit more context for that. I hope that was helpful. It can, in cases where someone has genuinely been harassed, obviously it's really unpleasant for the individual. So my advice always to employers is, if you get the sense that there's a bit of banter going on, just a reminder that this is a workplace, and that actually there's legal requirements in terms of, and you can be, especially in kind of the more startup type of arena, you can kind of be as blunt as to say, look guys, like this is going to be on me if you all make a mess here. Can we just tone it down a little bit, keep professional? That is always a good way to go. I'm really conscious of the time because I have got a hard stop at 12 because I've got another call.
I've got a quick question, Rebecca.
Yeah.
So, from the perspective of an employer versus an employee, are there any varying degrees of punishments when it comes to harassment? Or so, let's say if an employer is found guilty of harassment, what's the punishment like versus if an employee was found guilty of the same?
Yeah, so if I was harassed by a colleague in Capital Law, my first action would be to or it wouldn't be my first action, but my options would be to bring a claim against Capital Law. Capital Law would be potentially on the hook to pay me compensation for that. And obviously, there's the reputational issues associated with having been taken to an employment tribunal. The individual who actually harassed me, that would be for Capital to discipline that individual. Could mean that they'd lose their job, could mean that they are, they're subject to other disciplinary sanctions. So that's how that works. I wouldn't bring a claim necessarily against the individual who harassed me, not least because, first of all, they may not have as much money as my employer. Second of all, the employer is likely to say that they are vicariously liable for any actions of their employees. That's normal, that they would say, actually, this is on us, not least because if there is an option for them to say, no, actually that employee is completely rogue and we've sacked them actually, so this is on them. However, that's
okay,
not normal.
Yeah, that helped. Follow up to that. So, in the event that an employee is found to have harassed another employee, beyond just workplace punishments, can an employer take on an employee in the, let's say, in the court of law for damages
No.
of some sort?
No. The sanction,
Okay.
the sanction is the ending of the employment.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
No worries. So, skip it. So actually, this leads us quite nicely into dismissals. In the UK, you can only be dismissed for, hang on, one step back. In the UK, after you've had 2 years worth of employment, that's when your rights really crystallize and you're super duper protected, including against something called unfair dismissal, which is essentially a dismissal for anything that isn't one of these 5 potentially fair reasons. Before someone gets to 2 years service, you can dismiss them for any reason that's not a discriminatory reason. So please do, when you are employing people, please keep an eye on when someone's service is going to go over 2 years, particularly if you're thinking things aren't working out and that you might want to part ways, because once they hit that 2-year mark, they are protected in law against being unfairly dismissed. So the reasons you can fairly dismiss someone would be if they're to do with their capability, their conduct, so if they've misbehaved, if you no longer need them, so they're redundant, if there's some legal reason you can't continue to employ them, so say they've lost their immigration status, or there's this catch-all thing called some other substantial reason, which tends to be things like there's been an irretrievable breakdown in personalities or relationships in the office, for example, which doesn't neatly fit into conduct or capability, but it's this additional catch-all. Jason, got your hand up.
Hey, Rebecca. Just a quick one to clarify on that, right? So in Ireland, it's once you pass your probation period that you get full rights. So what you're saying is in the UK, even if you pass your probation period, you can still be dismissed quicker within the 2-year time frame.
Yeah. I think in Ireland, it might be 1 year that you've got unfair dismissal rights off the top of my head. But it might be sooner. But it's 2 years in the UK. Having said all of that, Labour have said they want to introduce unfair dismissal as a day 1 right. That will cause all sorts of problems. I don't know, and I don't know how it would work, because it just means it would be such a significant change to what happens all over the world, as far as in my experience. But we'll see if we get there.
Labour getting a lot of funding from legal companies, because that makes no sense. Why to do that?
I can't understand why they would do it. It would be madness. And would absolutely screw over so many of my employer clients.
Well, what would happen is you'd do away with full-time employees, and you'd actually go contractual work. You know what I mean? Because like you can't understand, or there's no guarantees on day 1 if someone's going to be the right fit for your company or not, and it's going to put too much pressure on companies.
I totally agree, and I hope it doesn't happen. But as you've suggested, it would make me very, very busy. So who knows? So I'm really sorry. I am sort of zooming through these last couple of slides because I've got to finish, as I said. If you get it wrong when it comes to dismissing someone can bring a claim. So this is after 2 years. Someone can bring a claim of unfair dismissal. Automatic unfair dismissal is where I won't go into this in too much detail, but there are certain things that if you dismiss someone, for example, because they've blown the whistle, that will be automatically unfair, and that's regardless of how long they've been with you. Constructive unfair dismissal, again, only applies when someone's been with you for over 2 years, but that's when someone resigns in response to a breach by you. So you've done something so bad as the employer that they've treated themselves as having been dismissed effectively. And it's a complicated claim to bring, but it exists. So again, if someone's resigning, particularly if they start using phrases like something's untenable, or that kind of language, that this is because of a relationship breakdown, do be alive to the fact that someone could potentially be gearing up for a constructive unfair dismissal claim.
Rebecca, on that, if they do say that they actually are looking at resigning, and you ask them, can you give me that in writing? And once you get it in writing, is that it? Or if they decide to withdraw it afterwards, if you accept it, is that it?
I'm working on a case at the moment where someone attempted to rescind their resignation and the rescindment wasn't accepted. As a whole, you don't have a duty to accept someone's rescinded resignation. The only thing I would say about that is if someone resigned, what we say in law, in the heat of the moment, so someone's, I don't know, really upset. They've often accompanied by some sort of potential mental health thing, whatever, and they've just said, I can't do this anymore, I'm resigning. In that situation, you may want, as the employer, to say, right, can you go away and think about that and come back? I'm not accepting your resignation at the moment because I think you need to calm down. So that's, I don't know if that answered your question, but yeah, you don't have
to. It doesn't. What it does is it actually nearly gives the person the opportunity afterwards to nearly say, well, I wasn't of clear mind, I was so angry. But like ultimately, if they made the decision, technically you can still just say, yeah, I'm not accepting it.
Yeah, and that is exactly what this case I'm working on at the moment is about. That the individual said, I resigned. I wasn't well at the time. You shouldn't have ever accepted it. I tried to rescind my resignation. You should have accepted the rescindment. But the employer's saying, well, no, I didn't have to. And that's ended up in a huge piece of litigation. But hopefully that doesn't happen. But these are the potential pitfalls, I suppose, which is why I'm flagging them to you. Wrongful dismissal, just really quickly on this one, is just where you fail to give someone their proper notice. So it sounds like it's something specifically or cleverly legal. It just literally just means it's a way of it's a breach, essentially a breach of contract claim, but you can bring it in the employment tribunal. Very quick zoom through some common pitfalls. So for me, these are the things that I see new employers fall down on the most. So inconsistent recruitment, not quite knowing exactly what you want as a business. You know, as business owners, you want to set the culture, the tone for your business, and having a framework in place which allows you to get the right people in, and test those people out in the right kind of way in order to achieve that culture or whatever is really important. Not getting employment status right, or going straight for employment when actually maybe someone as a contractor or a worker might be better for you in the first instance. Failing to protect company interests, just in general, things like not being careful with the banter that's going on, etc. Having very much off-the-shelf employment policies. I hate this, and it's not just because I'm saying that I want you to get me to draft them for you. I'd rather you did your own. Getting them off the shelf, having a textbook style staff handbook, which is nothing like the kind of it doesn't align with your cultures as a business at all. It's all very corporate and all the rest of it. I think the chocolate bar, Tony's Chocolonely. I normally show this on this presentation, but their employment contract is a one-pager which looks like something out of a comic book, because that's just the ethos of that company. That's how they want to present themselves, not just externally, but to their own employees, to help foster the culture they're trying to create. Not having good records, not having paper trails, that does my head in as an employment lawyer, as you can imagine. When I say to someone like, right, okay, can I have the minutes of that meeting? And there's, if there's anything, it's like something scribbled on the back of an envelope that's been left on the desk. And it's just really hard then to, if the employer is trying to say, well, no, that's not how it happened, for me to then help that employer. Not following procedure, both legal procedure, but your own procedures. You'd be surprised how often that happens, that there is one of these off-the-shelf policies in place, and then when it comes to actually doing something, the employer doesn't follow it. That comes up a lot. Not managing sickness absence properly. Of course, that has wider implications in terms of that individual, but it can really cause a problem for a business if that individual is left kind of to their own devices on whilst they're on sick leave. And then finally, just where there's not been a proper engagement with an employee, it can result in people just basically quiet quitting, I think, is the phrase that gets used a lot, where they're there, but they're not really there. And actually, if there was another offer somewhere else, they would go. I'm not going to go through this checklist because I've really got to go. But these are some of the things that I would recommend that you always think about before you think about actually hiring someone. Yeah, I can provide a bit more information about that maybe by email. And then I know I said I'd try and do some questions, but I'm really sorry. I knew I was going to struggle to get this in an hour. If you do have questions, please do feel free to let Sarah know, and then yeah, I can try and come back to you on email. Sorry.